Okay, so continuing from where we left off in the previous video with this pizza maker application, we've got our radio buttons already set up for the different crusts. So the next thing I want to go ahead and do is create a set of checkboxes for the toppings. So for this particular part, I'm just going to do a couple of checkboxes to just demonstrate briefly the way that you'd go about setting this up. If you want to, you could also kind of expand on this and try it with additional checkboxes beyond the ones I'm going to include. For this one, I'm mostly just going to use just two checkboxes for this. But the first thing I need to go ahead and do is bring in the checkbox control. So just like the rest of my controls, I'll need an import statement. So we're going to import from our scene.control.checkbox. Go ahead and bring that in. I then need to go ahead and start setting this up. So we'll go ahead and make my two checkboxes after all of this code related to the radio buttons. So we'll have our checkboxes, and for each of these two checkboxes that I'm going to make, it's going to be for two different toppings. So the two that I'm going to use, we'll just go with the two, I'd say probably the two most common toppings you'd see on a pizza, which are going to be pepperoni and bacon. So we'll make two checkboxes for the, one checkbox for each of these, so two total. So we'll have a checkbox, I'll call it pepperoni, it'll be a new checkbox, and then we'll set the string pepperoni. And just like with the radio buttons, when I put something into this string right here, that's essentially going to be some label that is placed beside the checkbox itself. I'm going to make another checkbox, I'll call this one bacon. This will be equal to a new checkbox. This will be for bacon. Okay. Next thing I want to go ahead and do is take these two checkboxes and put them into my scene. So right here, we'll go ahead and add them to this VBox that will then get placed as the root node for the scene. So I'll have our pepperoni and our bacon. Then I want to go ahead and also make one quick adjustment to the VBox itself. I'm going to make this a little bit longer and a little bit taller to start adding a little bit more spacing to the outer spacing for the application. So for this one, we'll do something like 300 by 300. Go ahead and try that and see how that looks. So go ahead and compile this and then run it. Okay. So at this point now we can see these two checkboxes here. If I click each one of these, you can see the little check mark being added to them when they're selected. And I can see that being taken away when they're deselected. So the thing to keep in mind about checkboxes that makes them unique to radio buttons is that whenever I select a particular radio button within this toggle group, it's going to only select that radio button and it deselects the previously selected radio button. So it'll constantly change. But in the case of checkboxes, selecting one particular checkbox or deselecting it has no effect on the other checkboxes. So they're all kind of independent of one another. Okay. The next thing I want to go ahead and do is actually add some functionality to this, and I'm going to set the functionality so that there's an additional little bit added to this string right here. So I want to go ahead and add some more text to this to tell me a little bit about the toppings that I'm adding. So coming back over here, we'll go ahead and close that and come back to the code. So I want to do this in such a way that the functionality for these two checkboxes is identical to each other. So this is a little bit different from what I did for the radio buttons, where I had to check the is selected for that particular button. So it was a little bit different for each, which is partly what justified doing a lambda expression for it, in addition to the fact that the code is fairly short, it's only 3 lines. But for this particular one, the code is going to be a little bit longer, and it's going to be identical for both of these checkboxes. So instead of doing this as a lambda expression or even as an anonymous inner class, I want to do this as a private inner class. So I'm going to come up to the top of this application, and I need to include a couple of other import statements. Since I'm going to do this as a private inner class, I need to bring in my event handler and action event, since I now need to explicitly provide each of those in the code. So we'll do our import JavaFX.event.event handler and JavaFX.event.action event. So I'm going to bring in both of those. And then I'm going to come down here and start setting up my private class. We'll call this topping action. This is going to implement the event handler for my action event. This is going to implement the handle class of our action event. Call it event. And then inside of here, I intend to essentially include another string, so another variable like I did for crust, that's related to the toppings portion of what I want to add to my output. But before I can start specifying something here, I need to also go ahead and include it here. And since I need to put it in two different locations, so we have it in the private inner class and we have it inside of the start method, I need to come up here and make sure that this is also a global variable. So I'll do private string, call it toppings. And this will be equal to a string that initially says you have not selected any toppings. So when the application first starts, this statement that I have right here is just going to say that I haven't selected anything, since by default neither of these checkboxes is going to be selected. And then I want to go ahead and start adding that to the end of my label. So both the initial label as well as whenever I set the text, I want to make sure that that toppings string is being shown. Okay. One other thing I'll go ahead and do as well is give it a space at the end of this sentence. Okay. Alright, so now that I've got that, then I can go ahead and set it up right here as well. So the way this is going to work is I will initially bring in that string, so we have our toppings. It's initially going to be reset to say the same thing that it says up here. You have not selected any toppings. And then I want to go ahead and modify it based on whether or not one of these checkboxes is selected. So since I need to go ahead and get those checkboxes right here, that tells me that I need to be able to declare them here, but then also provide some methods that I want to declare or to call on them within this handle method. So as we've seen before when I was showing a couple of different ways to create these event handlers, this indicates that I'm going to need to make sure that these are also global, since I need to access them in two different distinct scopes. So I'll go ahead and add them at the top here. And then I also need to move my label to this global scope, because once I get to the end of this, I'm going to need to set the text of the label at the very end of this handle method. So that also is going to be handled in two separate scopes, meaning that I need to move this out to this scope here. So our private, and then we'll add in that label. Okay. So let's just go ahead and set up the two checkboxes in the label and the global scope. We're still going to do all of the actual placement into the VBox and the scene within the start method. And then I also need to go ahead and add some functionality for the checkboxes within this handle method of my topping action class. Okay. So what I'm going to do for this is I want to check to see which of these checkboxes is selected, and then modify the string's contents based on those selections. So we want to do if pepperoni.is selected, and I also want to check if bacon.is selected. So I want to check to see if both of these checkboxes are selected. I want to go ahead and just say that both of the toppings are selected. So we're going to say for toppings, so this is now equal to you have selected pepperoni and bacon. Okay. Alternatively, we could select one of these but not the other. So I also want to make sure that the contents of the string are updated to reflect that particular combination of choices for the toppings. So we're going to say else if, and then I'm just going to take the Boolean expression that I have up here. I'm going to move that here, and then I'm going to say if one of these is not true, so we're going to put the exclamation point to change it from true to false. Basically the statement is if pepperoni is selected and if bacon is not selected. Then I want to go ahead and just say for my topping string, you have selected pepperoni, but we'll leave out the bacon. Okay. We can then go ahead and just take this whole portion that I've got right here. We'll copy that, place it right there. And then the change is going to be that rather than deselecting the bacon, it'll be if the pepperoni is not selected, and if the bacon is selected, we'll say you have selected bacon. And then if none of these three conditions are true, then that means that they're both deselected, meaning that we have not selected any toppings. So we'll just go ahead and leave it as what it is up here. And we don't need to include another condition for that since I've already set it up to say that, assuming that it's true that neither of these is selected. So then the last thing I need to do is to go grab that output label. We want to go ahead and set the text. And the text needs to be set to the exact same string that we've been using for all of our other conditions for our radio buttons and our initial setup. Okay. And then the last thing I need to go ahead and do, since I've made this topping action class, I need to go ahead and register this to my two checkboxes. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right, let's say right here, after all of the code related to my my radio buttons has been set up, including the event handlers for all three radio buttons. I'm then going to go ahead and register the event handler for each of my checkboxes. So we're going to have our pepperoni dot set on action. So use that set on action method again, and we'll say new topping action, and then we'll have bacon dot set on action. We'll have our new topping action. Okay, so now this will provide the functionality for each of these two checkboxes to update accordingly. One last thing I want to go ahead and do is see about modifying the width of this a little bit more. We're going to change that to about 350, and that should be long enough now so that the entire string displays, including this extra little bit about toppings that I've added to the end. So I'll save it like that. We'll go ahead and compile this and run it. Still not quite long enough. We'll go ahead and extend this to make it visible. Need it to be about right there. I think that's going to be about 500. So we can see the two parts to this now. So you have selected the traditional crust, so it's got that default value set, and then you have not selected any toppings. So we also have that default value that I gave in the string at the beginning of the application. If I change the crust, you can see that update accordingly. We can then go ahead and change this. So now let's say you have selected pepperoni. We change it to both. We can see that you have selected pepperoni and bacon. If I remove the pepperoni, it'll say you have selected bacon. And if I take that off, it'll say you have not selected any toppings. And then if I select these and modify this, we can see that the crust will change, and it also still says you have selected pepperoni and bacon, so that part isn't affected when I change the type of crust, only when I change the contents of these checkboxes. Okay. So other than the width, we'll go ahead and make one quick modification just to see a good width for this. So rather than 350, let's say maybe 500 would be more effective. Maybe reduce the height to about 200. Take a quick moment to look at this. Okay, so you see it like that. Select both. Everything fits right on the edge. That's pretty much the perfect width for it. Yep, so that looks good. So that's going to wrap up everything for the radio buttons and the checkboxes for this little pizza maker application. For the next set of videos, we're going to start looking at a slightly more complex control, which is going to be the list view. So we're going to go through an introduction of that, and then go through a lot of different functionalities and behaviors that you can set up for list views.